President Lincoln found himself facing loud voices from the halls of Congress and the press calling for action. It had been 3 months since the bombardment of Fort Sumter, and the sands of the hourglass were running out on the 90-day call of service for the 75,000 volunteers that he had mustered to squash the secession of the Confederate States. This army of volunteers expected, as those loud voices in the press and the government, a short war with few casualties and easily won. With calls of "On to Richmond," the streets of Washington were filled with excitement as troops gathered to prepare to march into Virginia to take the Confederate capital. Join us as we briefly explore the Battle of First Manassas. Few paid attention to a simply dressed farm girl who had been in Washington's Market Square selling sweet cream and buttermilk on July the 10th, 1861. Soon she was packing up her unsold goods into her old farm cart and headed out. Riding through the Georgetown section of town, she passed through rows of Union soldier tents and even the 1st Massachusetts Infantry headquarters. Maybe because of her unassuming and unthreatening appearance, she being simply dressed and riding on an old farm cart, or maybe because the green troops in this young war failed to realize anything suspicious with this woman, she was able to cross the chain bridge into Virginia, unapproached and unquestioned. She turned her horse and cart and heads down a dirt lane and would soon arrive at a friend's plantation where she rests for the evening. This young lady has a secret. Betty Duvall was her name. At age 16, she was said to have had untold beauty and an unflinching nerve. Betty had caught the eye of Washington socialite Rosa Neal Greenhow. Miss Greenhow, or Wild Rose as she was known, was a Southern sympathizer. Living in the nation's capital on the corner of 13th and 9th Streets, not far away from the White House, Rose found herself in the circles of many of Washington's political and military elites. She was recruited to be a spy for the Confederate government, which she accepted and then volunteered to organize a spy ring of her own. When she had discovered the Union's plans and date for attacking Confederate forces and seizing the major railway junction at Manassas, Wild Rose sent Betty to deliver the warning. On July the 11th, 1861, Betty arrived at the Confederate lines outside of Fairfax Courthouse, Virginia. No longer wearing the modest dress of a simple farm girl, she was now donning a stylish riding habit. Betty was able to talk herself into delivering her message to the officer in charge, who was Brigadier General Mildred Bonham. Incredibly enough, Bonham had just given orders that no more females were to pass through the lines. Upon meeting General Bonham, Betty explained that she had an urgent message for General P.G.T. Beauregard. Upon my announcing that I would faithfully forward at once, she took out her tucking comb and let fall the longest, most beautiful roll of hair I had ever seen. She took then from the back of her head, where it had been safely tied, a small package not larger than a silver dollar sewn up in silk, Bonham would later recall. This message that she had delivered that day would change the course of the battle to come. Crowds overflowing with excitement filled the streets, and cheers bellowed into the air in Washington City on Tuesday, the 16th day of July, 1861. General Irving McDowell was leading his federal army of more than 35,000 soldiers strong. As the dust kicked up from the boots of thousands of men drifted up over their heads, many in this army of green recruits couldn't imagine the tasks and horrors that they would be facing in the coming years. Moving slowly through the North Virginia countryside, the first objective for McDowell's army in this plan to take Richmond and bring a swift end to this war was a vital railroad junction. It was located a little more than 25 miles away from the federal capital city of Washington City in the small town of Manassas Junction, located near a creek called Bull Run. If McDowell can take control of this railroad junction, he could keep 11,000 Confederates of the Army of Shenandoah under Joseph E. Johnston in the Shenandoah Valley. But this lumbering army was being watched. Waiting for McDowell in Manassas was Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard and his Army of the Potomac. Armed with the information delivered by Betty Duvall, Beauregard had been preparing. Meanwhile, at the head of the Shenandoah Valley stood Union General Robert Patterson with nearly 18,000 men under his command. Patterson's job was to keep the Army of Shenandoah in place. July 17th found the pieces coming together for the upcoming battle. Beauregard informed Confederate President Jefferson Davis of the Union Army's movements. Word was also sent out by telegraph to General Johnston that the anticipated Union advance had begun. Johnston, confident that Patterson's forces would stay put, immediately agreed to shift his forces to Manassas. Johnston's men in the valley slipped away from the Federals watching them and marched to link up with trains that had been sent to join them with Beauregard's forces at Manassas. This was the first time in military history that troops will be transported to a battlefield by train. The following day would see elements from both armies meet up. General McDowell would order Brigadier General Daniel Tyler to find a fording point to cross Bull Run and ordered him to keep up the impression that we are moving on Manassas. Informed by locals that the Confederate troops had retreated from the area towards a crossing called Blackburn's Ford, land owned by a sugar broker named William McLean, Tyler and his troops would follow. Lying in wait on the opposite side of Blackburn's Ford were Confederate forces under Brigadier General James Longstreet concealed in the woods. In what would be known as the Battle of Blackburn's Ford or the skirmish at Blackburn's Ford, the outnumbered Union troops and Confederate forces would engage in battle. The Union artillery would open fire with little effect. William McLean's house was struck by one of these shots, smashing through the fireplace. The house was being used as headquarters by General Beauregard, who at the time was eating his dinner. A comical effect of this artillery fight was the destruction of dinner of myself and staff by a Federal shell that fell into the fireplace of my headquarters at the McLean house, Beauregard would later write in his diary. On a side note, William McLean would in the spring of 1863 move his family to get out of the war's path. They would resettle about 120 miles south of Manassas in Appomattox County in a tiny community of Appomattox Courthouse. This home, his new home, would be the setting for another historic Civil War event. It would be here in April of 1865, Robert E. Lee, Confederate General of the Army of North Virginia, would surrender to Union General Ulysses S. Grant, effectively ending this war between the states. William McLean is supposed to have said, "The war began in my front yard and ended in my front parlor." After some brief but intense fighting, Union forces pulled back. This caused McDowell to reconsider the frontal assault along Bull Run Creek. After a few days to replan, McDowell decided to flank the Confederate line by crossing far beyond the Confederate left flank. McDowell would instead launch his attack from Sudley Ford, wheeling around the Confederate lines and catching them by surprise. July the 20th saw the arrival of General Joseph E. Johnston. Now, with Beauregard's Army of the Potomac and Johnston's Army of the Shenandoah linked, these two generals began their planning. They were worried that when Union General Patterson realized that Johnston had slipped away, he would march towards Manassas to join McDowell, creating a Union force too large to attack. These Confederate generals decided to concentrate their forces around Blackburn's Ford, and it would be here that they would meet the Union attack to destroy it. Afterwards, their plan was to bring in fresh troops to cross Bull Run, circle around the Union Army, and cut off the retreat. In the early hours of the 21st, a fateful move was made when Johnston, realizing that his center and left of his lines needed to be shored up, moved a brigade of South Carolinians under Bernard B. and a Virginian brigade to the left. The Virginia's commander, a colonel named Thomas Jonathan Jackson. On the morning of July 21st, McDowell sent divisions of Hunter and Heintzelman, some 12,000 men, from Centerville around 2:30 in the morning, marching southwest on the Warrenton Turnpike, then turning northwest towards Sudley Springs to get around the Confederates' left. A Confederate division, headed by Tyler, consisted of about 8,000 men, marched directly towards the Stone Bridge. Tyler's division blocked the advance of the main flanking column on the turnpike, setting them back and further complicating McDowell's plan of attack. Just after 5 a.m., Union artillery awoke, firing several rounds across Bull Run to signal the planned coordinated attack. Bungled orders and poor communications prevented their effective execution. Nicknamed Shanks by his West Point classmates for his long, skinny legs, Colonel Nathan Evans and his Confederate troops were positioned at the Stone Bridge. Known as the best drinker, an eloquent swearer, and a magnificent bragger, Evans was also infamous for what he called his barrelito, a barrel of whiskey strapped to the back of his orderly. Regardless of his penchant for drinking, the 21st would find him ready for the day's fight. Repelling Union attacks by Brigadier General Daniel Tyler's troops, Colonel Evans began to suspect that these engagements were feints because the Union troops seemed content to remain on their side of Bull Run. Keeping his men largely concealed, Evans had only his pickets trade fire with the Union soldiers as he awaited a more serious advance. Evans was right about this being a decoy. Around 9 o'clock in the morning, Confederate signal officer Captain Edward Porter Alexander caught sight of bayonets off in the distance, glistening in the morning sun. It was the Union flanking column making its way across Sudley Ford. Captain Alexander immediately informed both headquarters and Evans, "Look to your left, you are turned." In another military first, this was the first time use of wigwag flags signaling in combat. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Evans moved the bulk of his men to block its advance, leaving only a few to hold off Tyler at the Stone Bridge. As he took his position on the slopes of Matthews Hill, it appeared as though Evans, with a lone brigade, would take on 2 full Union divisions. Meanwhile, Confederate Generals B and Francis Bartow had heard the firing earlier in the morning and moved their brigades from its position in the center to a location further to the left. They marched up Henry House Hill, which was to the east of Matthews Hill. As B and Bartow looked on, the lead troops of the Union flanking column under Rhode Islander Ambrose Burnside encountered Evans' line. Soon, Evans would be joined by the 1st Louisiana Special Battalion, Wheat's Tigers, led by Major Chatham Robidoux Wheat, standing over 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighing 275 pounds. He was a mountain of a man. His size, his black hair, dark eyes, and dramatic mustache gave him the appearance of a roguish brute. Leading a delaying attack, Wheat would take a Union bullet through his lungs. He would be taken to a field hospital where doctors told him that the wound would prove to be fatal. To this he replied, "I don't feel like dying yet." "But there's no instance on record of recovery from a wound such as yours," one doctor had told him. Wheat's response, "Well, then I will put my case on record." He would die, however, not until almost a year later on June 27, 1862, mortally wounded on another battlefield, at the Battle of Gaines' Mill. For nearly an hour, Evans and his Confederates held. As they began to break under the pressure of the Union advance, B's and Bartow's brigades arrived from Henry House Hill. Fighting between Burnside's Union troops and Evans, Bartow's, and B's Confederates continued. Soon, however, another Union commander would arrive. William T. Sherman, with a Union brigade, crossed Bull Run at Poplar Ford, which lie back behind the Confederate lines on Matthews Hill. As this new Union brigade entered the fray, Confederate lines began to break, prompting a retreat. Now it looked as if McDowell had put the Confederates to flight as the battered remnants of the 3 Confederate brigades on Matthews Hill fled eastwards towards Henry House Hill. McDowell, seeing the rebels fleeing in disarray and flushed with success, rode along the line shouting, "Victory, victory, the day is ours." However, he made a critical mistake. Instead of following up his advantage, McDowell and his men unexplainably paused and ceased operations for about 2 hours in the early afternoon. Johnston and Beauregard, however, early in the fighting, started moving more troops towards their left. This was a costly error for McDowell because Colonel Thomas J. Jackson began to form a new defensive line with his brigade of Virginians along Henry House Hill. After the pause, McDowell ordered the artillery batteries of Ricketts and Griffin to move to Henry House Hill for close infantry support. There, the Union's 11 guns engaged in a fierce artillery duel against Jackson's 13. Now, unlike many engagements in the Civil War, here the Confederate artillery had an advantage. The Union pieces were now within range of the Confederate smoothbore cannons, and the predominantly rifled pieces of the Union side were ineffective at such close ranges, with many shots fired over the heads of their targets. As the Union attacks on Henry House Hill intensified, an exhausted and irritated General B rode up and shouted to Colonel Jackson, "The enemy is driving us!" Jackson, atop his horse, leaned forward and replied with what would be his common response to meeting Union forces head-on, "Then, sir, we will give them the bayonet." General B rode back to his men, who were retreating to the rear, and implored them to rally on Jackson. B shouted, "There is Jackson, standing like a stone wall. Let us determine to die here, and we will conquer. Rally behind the Virginians." From that day on, Thomas J. Jackson would be known as Stonewall Jackson, and Virginia's 1st Brigade that he commanded would be called the Stonewall Brigade. Fighting swirled back and forth all along Henry House Hill as both sides fed more troops into the fight. Uniforms had not been yet standardized, and both armies carried similar-looking flags. As a result, both Confederate and Union troops fell victim to friendly fire. Troops fired on their comrades thinking that they were the enemy, or were able to approach their opponents easily and open fire. In the fight on Henry House Hill, both Confederate Generals B and Bartow had lost their lives. The Charleston Mercury would later report in the reminiscences of the late General Bernard E. B. While advancing at the head of his troops, the fatal ball struck him from his horse, inflicting a mortal wound, and he was borne from the field by the officers of his staff. Though suffering severely, he roused himself on the succeeding morning and asked the fate of the day. When told that the enemy was totally routed, an expression of satisfaction passed across his features, and a few hours afterwards, the spirit of the patriot soldier passed calmly away. This part of the battle would also claim the life of the first civilian of the war, the widow Henry, who had refused to leave her house. Her daughter Ellie survived as she took refuge in a large fireplace, but suffered permanent hearing loss from artillery shot after shot striking the chimney. After the battle, the widow Henry was removed by her sons and buried next to her home. By 3 o'clock, the Confederates had gained the upper hand at Henry House Hill. McDowell ordered an advance on Chinn Ridge, southwest of Henry House Hill, in the hopes of turning the battle back in his favor by flanking the Confederate position. Unfortunately for McDowell, the Confederates anticipated this. Brigades under Arnold Easley and Jubal Early moved into position and thwarted the Union advance towards Chinn Ridge. McDowell, realizing that he was defeated, ordered a withdrawal. Covered by United States regulars, the retreat began in an orderly fashion, but soon panic inflicted the fleeing Union soldiers. They threw down their weapons and began to run. Further adding to the confusion and fear were 100 or so civilians who had traveled from Washington to view the carnage of battle. Men and women, some with their children in tow, had made their way to Manassas armed with picnic baskets and opera glasses to witness what they believed would be an easy victory for the Union troops. These looky-loos were swept up by a mass of soldiers making their escape. While taking in the late afternoon lunch after the early Union successes on Matthews Hill, a chaotic scene began to unfold before these Washington looky-loos. A loud rumbling drew their attention from their meal, when the road before them filled with horses and wagons as hundreds of soldiers took flight, retreating towards the stone bridge. Soon, abandoned cannons, wagons, and supplies littered the road. Massachusetts Senator Henry Wilson stepped in and, armed with his picnic basket, attempted to hand out sandwiches to the retreating soldiers. A Confederate shell destroyed his buggy, killing his horse. He would make his escape on a stray mule. Michigan Senator Zachariah Chandler tried to block the road in order to stop the fleeing troops, while Senator Ben Wade of Ohio took a different approach to halt the retreat by picking up a discarded rifle and threatening to shoot any soldier who ran until he himself threw down his weapon and took flight. Iowa Senator James Grimes had nearly been captured by Confederate forces. After successfully escaping and making his way back to Washington City, Grimes vowed to never go near another battlefield again. New York Congressman Representative Alfred Ely had a different battlefield experience. Before Manassas, Ely was a loud voice calling out the battle cry of "On to Richmond." On that 21st day of July, he found himself on the way to the capital of the South, but as a prisoner of war captured by the Confederate Army. Ely would later write, "While under the tree of the above mentioned, that a company of infantry issued from the woods, marching in great haste, double quick, with a military officer on horseback leading the advance. On arriving within 10 rods of the spot where I was standing, the company halted. 2 officers then came forward to the tree and inquired who I was, and I told them my name was Alfred Ely. 'What state are you from?' 'From the state of New York,' I replied. 'Are you connected in any way to the government?' 'Yes.' 'In what way, sir?' 'A representative in Congress.' One of the officers, a captain, immediately seized me by my arm and said that I was their prisoner, and took from me the pistol which I had that morning borrowed from Mr. Seth Green. He took nothing else. The officer repeatedly assured me that I was not to be harmed, and behaved with kindness and courtesy. He took me to a colonel sitting on horseback and introduced me in these words: 'Colonel, this is Mr. Ely, representative in Congress from New York.' To which the colonel, in a most angry tone, replied, drawing his pistol and pointing it directly at my head, 'Damn your white lily-livered soul, I'll blow your brains out on the spot.' The captain and another officer rushed before the colonel and prevented him from carrying out his threat, the former exclaiming, 'Colonel, you must not shoot that pistol. He is our prisoner.' Held for over 5 months at Libby Prison, Ely was released on Christmas Day. Rumors swirled that the Confederate cavalry was closing in on the troops, when in reality only a small force was sent after the retreating Union forces. Upon reaching Centerville, McDowell decided that a full withdrawal was needed in order to reorganize his men. McDowell and his men retreated through Centerville and onward to Washington. Although some units fled in panic, enough Union troops maintained their composure to hold the Confederates at bay and protect the evacuation. Disorganized and exhausted themselves, the Confederates were unable to maintain their pursuit of the fleeing Union Army. Before First Manassas, many believed that a single battle would decide the war and that the bloodshed would be minimal. The Union troops would suffer 2,896 casualties and the Confederates 1,897, making First Manassas the bloodiest battle in American history to date, with far bloodier still to come before this war between states would end and brother would cease killing brother. The First Battle of Manassas was a pivotal moment in the early stages of the American Civil War. Its outcome not only provided crucial insights to both sides, but also set the stage for future battles and the protracted conflict that would ensue. The battle underscored the need for strategic planning, military expertise, and the sacrifices that would be required to secure victory in this unprecedented struggle. Today, you could walk in the footsteps of those who on July 21, 1861, engaged in this first major land engagement, as well as the Second Battle of Manassas at the Manassas National Battlefield Park. Begin your visit to the park at the Henry House Visitor Center. Here, you can pick up a park brochure, trail guide, and learn about the daily schedule of interpretive programs. A museum features artifacts related to the First and Second Battles of Manassas. The Manassas National Battlefield Park encompasses nearly 5,100 acres of land with more than 40 miles of hiking trails, as well as a series of loop trails that traverse the key areas of the First and Second Manassas battlefields and include trailside interpretive markers describing the battle action that occurred around that area and highlight the experiences of both soldiers and civilians. To learn more about the American Civil War and the Battle of First Manassas, head on down to your school or local public library and check out one of the many books that are available. Also, check the description box for a link to the Manassas National Battlefield Park. Please share and subscribe, and as always, thank you from the History and Heritage Explorers. Until next time, keep on exploring.